All right, guys. So, hey, listen, this is Dr. Scott with Elite Family Chiropractic, guys. I'm super excited that we get to be here tonight. I'm really excited because one of the biggest things about my job that I really care about is making sure that we're able to reach and educate parents who are dealing with struggles with their kids at home. So as we go through tonight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this thing that we call the perfect storm. When I flip to my slideshow in a few minutes, one of the things that I think that I want you to get from this is that there are so many things that we as parents are not being told. There are so many things that are being overlooked in the way that our kids are being managed from a healthcare perspective. And so when we dig into this, what I want to do is I want to share a lot of the things that my wife and I had to learn by digging into this and trying to find this information ourselves to help our little girl. And so tonight's topic is about meltdowns. And when we talk about the concept of meltdowns, it is a big, painful topic for a lot of us. Because when our children are having meltdowns, they are so, they can be so explosive, they can happen so frequently, and they can put all of us on eggshells. And so as parents, we find ways that we oftentimes have to alter our lives. We have to avoid the things that we call that create triggers. We find that we're walking on eggshells constantly, and the stress that it creates in our home can be absolutely massive. So what I want to do tonight is I want to start talking through not just the meltdowns themselves, but I want to talk about what is happening inside that we get to the point that our child is having the meltdowns. What is happening that gets to a point where their nervous system is so on stress mode, fight or flight overdrive, that they can't stop themselves from having meltdowns. So I'm going to flip to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to share my screen with you guys here. So as I pull this up, do me a favor and let me know in the chat if you can see my screen here when I pull up the PowerPoint. Okay. So can you guys see this okay? Drop a comment here so I can see if you can see it. Perfect. All right, awesome. So guys, as we go through this tonight, so what I want to do is I want to give you a ton of information. I want to give you some hope. I want to give you answers. And I want to give you the help that you need so that if you have a child that's struggling with meltdowns, that you can know with certainty what you can do to help them. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about us, right? So we are a pediatric and family practice. My name is Dr. Scott Haggerty. I am a co-owner with my wife, Dr. Lena Haggerty of Elite Family Chiropractic in North Royalton, Ohio. So the picture that you see on the left there, that's me and my beautiful munchkins. So that is my wife, Dr. Lena Haggerty, my daughter Olivia, and my son Elijah in the picture on the left. So my daughter is the reason that we stepped into this world because, you know, she's going to be 11 this Saturday, hard to believe, but from the time that she was a baby until the time that she was about 5 years old, we struggled mightily with her. That poor little lady from the very beginning had major league issues. You know, she was a very difficult labor and delivery. And I'm going to kind of give you the synopsis on this because I want you to understand a little bit more about our story. So as we connect pieces tonight, why this makes sense. So when we were first, when my wife first became pregnant, we were in chiropractic school. And it was probably one of the most stressful times in our entire life. My wife was taking national boards. We were trying to finish up chiropractic school, prepping for a move back to Ohio, thinking about looking for a job for the first time in nearly 4 years. It was a very stressful time, a lot of pressure, a lot of things on us. When we were pregnant, my wife was planning to do a total natural vaginal delivery. We went through Bradley classes, planned to have the perfect labor and delivery. And as many people can relate to, it did not go that way. My wife's labor and delivery ended up being a long 33 hours. My daughter, very quickly after labor started, became stuck at 8 centimeters, and my wife could not pass that. And so we did everything that we possibly could to try and help her to be able to get fully dilated, to get my daughter into the birth canal, but she couldn't. So when we hit 28 hours, we made the decision that it was time for my wife and my daughter to take a break. And my wife and I made the decision that she was going to get an epidural. And the epidural then, thank the Lord, allowed her to rest for a little while because the contractions were so intense. They were coming every 2 minutes and they were incredibly painful. What we didn't know at that point in time is that my daughter was wedged with her head and her face directly into my wife's pubic bone. So with every single contraction, my daughter's head and neck were being jammed into my wife's pubic bone. And when she was delivered, we saw the evidence of this, and I'll explain a little bit more in a second. So after about 2 hours of rest, they gave my wife Pitocin to get labor started again. And if you know anything about Pitocin, one of the things that it does, it increases the intensity of the contractions quite a bit, up to as much as 6 times the strength of your own natural body's contractions. So my wife was getting some very intense contractions. The OB really had to help my daughter to get into the birth canal, so much so that he literally had to put his hand up inside and scoop my daughter's head and neck and pull her into the birth canal. When she was delivered, it was a very, very rough delivery. There was a ton of traction. There was a ton of torque. My poor little daughter's head and neck had been through so much. Right from the very beginning, we knew that something was not right. Right after we got her back from the nurses, after they checked her APGARs and got her vitals, the very first thing that we saw was that that sweet little thing was holding her head up. And at that point in time, I thought, wow, my daughter's so strong. What I did not realize is that my daughter had evidence of a birth injury. So her neck muscles should not be strong enough until she's about 4 months old to hold her head upright on her own. But she was doing it at birth, which meant that her neck muscles were kicking in to protect her spinal cord because she'd had so much trauma from the labor and delivery that her neck had a major injury. We also noticed soon after that she had a torticollis. If you've never heard of a torticollis, it is an acute head tilt. Some people call it wry neck. A lot of babies will go into physical therapy for it. We being chiropractors, we got her adjusted. But she had a pretty nasty torticollis. And when we put her on my wife so that she could breastfeed, she couldn't latch. And so right away, we knew that some things were not awesome. And these latching issues, they progressed. They got worse and worse and worse. So once we got her home, latching never got better. And what she became was incredibly colicky, incredibly irritable, incredibly motion-seeking baby who barely slept and required tons and tons of motion to get her calm enough so that she would fall asleep. And when I say tons, what I mean is like it would be us having to walk her, rock her, and move her constantly for sometimes hours at a time, and walking her at a pace that was just short of a run to get enough motion for her to feel calm enough to fall asleep, only to set her down, to have her wake up screaming again. And many a day when I was in chiropractic school, I would walk in after a long day, and my wife was in tears, handing me my daughter because she'd screamed and cried nearly the entire day, and she'd never been able to put her down, and she was exhausted. And this was our life for the first year. When we moved back to Cleveland, my daughter was 9 months old, and we opened our chiropractic practice, and it was a struggle. She didn't sleep, she cried all the time, and she was getting to a point where her symptoms were becoming significantly more noticeable. Not only was sleep, already bad, but she was becoming more and more constipated. So she was constipated early on, but not bad. But as she went through the next several months, it got much worse to the point where we're having to give her suppositories and things like that to try and get her to make bowel movements. And it was bad. And even when we would adjust her, it was only a very temporary change, and we can never get the cycle broken. By the time that she's becoming a toddler, my sweet little girl now is starting to have other signs. She's having signs that she is starting to develop some tics. She's starting to do a lot of stimming. By the time that she's in preschool, we are seeing a lot of signs of anxiety, and she's starting to stim, and things were continuing to evolve. And as it relates to today, she was developing one heck of a temper. By the time that she is in preschool, we are having meltdowns 7 days a week, and they would last anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour at a time. And they were over trivial stuff. And if you're a parent who's been through this, whether you're watching us on Zoom or you're watching on Facebook, drop a comment in there if you can relate to this. It would be something as simple as we would ask her what she wanted for dinner, and then we would give her what she wanted for dinner, and then she'd throw a temper tantrum about it for like 45 minutes. Or we ask her what she wanted to wear to chiropractic school, what she wanted to wear to school the next day. And we give her that exact outfit, and she'd throw a temper tantrum over the outfit that she picked. And it was little things like that that would trip her up all the time. She had a very, very explosive temper. So I know that this is what many of you are dealing with, and this is the struggle that we had. When we were in that position, we got to a point where when she was about 4.5 years old, where we were getting desperate because it was affecting every aspect of our quality of life. It was affecting our marriage. The stress between us was tremendous. And like a lot of dads, right? And this is something that maybe some of you moms who are watching this experience, like a lot of dads, I tried to put my head in the sand because we had tried so many things. And what we've been told by her pediatrician is that she'll grow out of it. It'll get better. She'll grow out of it. And we heard it from so many people. And we tried all these other things. We had tried proper nutrition. We were anti-inflammatory. We were gluten-free. No milk. Kids were on proper supplementation. They were getting adjusted. And nothing was seeming to allow her to turn the corner. Her quality of life was not awesome. Ours was not awesome. And the struggles were beginning to mount. And so what ended up happening is that by God's grace and intervention, when we got to a point where we were at our most desperate, we had a bright light come into our world. When we were in chiropractic school, my wife and I had gone to a presentation by a Dr. Tony Evil, who had a pediatric and family chiropractic practice out in Crystal Lake, Illinois, where he worked with kids with autism, ADHD, sensory processing, meltdowns, you name it, that was his specialty. And at that point in time, I wasn't in a place where I wanted to hear it. I was in the process of getting a master's degree in sports science and exercise rehab, in addition to my doctor of chiropractic degree. But my wife was interested in pediatrics. That was where her heart was. And so we met him. She was very impressed with him. After that presentation's over, kind of left my thought process, but she always was impressed with him. So fast forward, now my daughter's 4.5, and we are really desperate for help. And all of a sudden, my wife starts seeing in her Facebook feed, like probably many of you who are here tonight, saw in her Facebook feed, our doctor friends posting stories of little kids just like our daughter who were overcoming their challenges by chiropractic care in their offices. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, what in the heck are they doing? We've done all these things and nothing is changing. What is it they're doing different? And so what they all said is, you need to contact Tony Evil. So we did. And the conversation that we had with him was an absolutely life-changing conversation. So I'm going to show you a video, and I want to show this to you because I think it's a really important table setter for what we're about to dig into. Okay, so go ahead and watch the video. Tell me what you see.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? Go! The answer is 13.
What did you guys get? Did you get 13 more or less? Okay, but here's the interesting part. Did you see the moonwalking bear? Watch it again.
But did you see the moonwalking bear? No!
You see it right there, walking right into the screen. Right there, there's the moonwalking bear. Now, why do I show that to you? Because you don't miss what you're not looking for. And when we talk about this concept of the perfect storm, what we learned in the conversation with him is that we didn't know what we were looking for. There was so much that we had been missing. There were so many things that we'd overlooked. And like many parents that we talk to, they have been told that it's normal, they'll grow out of it. But what they've been watching is a storm brewing inside of their child. And what we learned as a result of that conversation is that my daughter had been through a brewing perfect storm that was leading to the signs and symptoms that we were seeing. And so when we talk about the perfect storm, what it is, it's an algorithm. It is this very predictable, repeatable algorithm that we see parent after parent after parent going through, seeing their kids go down this pathway towards one symptom after another as a result of these really crazy, stressful beginnings to life. Because I'll tell you, one of the big things that when we had this conversation to talk about my daughter's struggles, and we talked with Dr. Evil about the perfect storm, there was this repetitive theme. He said, the one thing that really bothers me is that so many times parents are never told what's causing this. And if they knew what was causing this, they could do something to change it. Now, listen, guys, I'm a chiropractor, right? Unabashedly, I love it. It's the greatest job in the entire world. But even I missed it because I didn't know what I was looking for. And so what he explained to me in that conversation is that the stress that my wife had been under had predisposed my daughter's nervous system to be stressed out, because the placenta is not just a food network. It is also a communication network that connects the baby's nervous system to mom's nervous system. And this is a really important concept because my wife was on overdrive and she was putting out stress hormones. Those stress hormones crossed the placenta, and my daughter was receiving those stress hormones because there's a critical developmental window between weeks 28 and 32, and my daughter's nervous system goes from developing in fight or flight mode, parasympathetic and sympathetic, right? You're gonna hear these words a lot tonight. My daughter's sympathetic nervous system is what developed first. Her spinal cord, her sympathetic nervous system to preserve her life. Between weeks 28 and 32, there's a natural transition in the development of the brain where her parasympathetic nervous system, which what regulates growth, development, healing, and higher level brain function for life outside of the womb is supposed to kick in. When you have a sympathetic dominant parent, mom in stress mode, creating lots of stress hormones, then what ends up happening is that those stress hormones cross the placenta and they supercharge the fight or flight response in my daughter, and in turn delaying the transition point from her sympathetic to her parasympathetic system, making her fight or flight systems more active. And there is a lot of research on this that we will dive into later. So I never understood this, never even thought about this. And then what he tied together for us is that my wife's labor process was incredibly stressful for my daughter as well as for my wife. And what the result of that is that my daughter had a very traumatic delivery. And what I did not realize, even with my chiropractic mind as a student, is that the trauma that my daughter went through as a result of the birth process created a cascade of events that put her nervous system into a nonstop persistent fight or flight that she could not shut off. And let's dig into this here in a lot of depth, because this is a really common story that we hear, right? So we look at kind of the before picture, right? So every parent that we talk to has some version of this, that there's these different stressors that they're exposed to. So maybe it's fertility stress, maybe it's pregnancy stress, but then we see that in 90% of births on average, right? So technically the stat is 87%. So when they collect stats, right, Health and Human Services and all medical stats, 87% of all live births right now has an intervention. This is a huge change that is heavily overlooked in our culture. So back when I was born 46 years ago in 1975, the rate of intervention was under 30%. That rate has dramatically increased over the course of the last 40 years. Now we are at a year in, year out intervention rate at greater than 87%. We have cesarean sections are at a rate of at least 33% or more on an annual basis and rising. And we see these intervention rates, and we oftentimes completely dismiss the effect of what they have. But this is a big piece of this, and we'll dig into this here in a few minutes. But the result of the stressed out pregnancy and the high intervention rates at delivery and the amount of force that's used to go and rip our babies out of the birth canal, they're oftentimes completely overlooked. And listen, let's talk about this for a second in terms of force, right? Because, you know, in a standard natural vaginal delivery, the amount of force that's used on a baby is anywhere from 20 to 40 pounds of axial traction. I'm going to flip my screen back here, get out of this. I want you to see this. So what we're talking about is anywhere from 20 to 40 pounds of axial traction, right here, traction with lateral bending and rotation on a baby's little neck. That is a tremendous amount of force, but that's not even the worst of it. When you get into things like a Pitocin, epidural, when the doctor really has to go and do a lot of work to try and get the baby out, like my daughter, those force ratings from the OB stats range anywhere from 40 to as high as 80 pounds of axial traction, okay? If you get into a cesarean section, 40 to 60 pounds is average. If you get into using a forceps or a vacuum in either one of those scenarios, the force ratings can go above 100 pounds. 100 pounds on a baby's neck. So imagine taking a baby, picking them up here, swinging them by their neck with a 100-pound weight on their feet. That is essentially what is happening to a newborn. To me, that's just unfathomable that this is what's happening to our babies and no one's talking about it. Because I saw it firsthand, and I've seen it here hundreds upon hundreds of times, that these early intervention stressors create massive, massive stress on a baby's nervous system. And what we see on a consistent basis is the side effect. Because then what we start to see happening is we start to see these symptoms. We start to see a stressed, colicky, irritated baby that's dealing with, ear infections, and they're constipated and they're not sleeping well, and they need constant motion to get calmed down and go to sleep. And as they evolve and they get into toddler stage, you're seeing that they're starting to show a lot of stress. They're starting to get sick a lot. Maybe they're getting ear infection, respiratory infections, and croup and RSV. And they start to have behavioral challenges and start to see the first signs of the meltdowns. Maybe as they get a little bit older, by the time they become a child and starting to hit like elementary school, you're starting to see maybe, they're potentially being diagnosed as being on the spectrum, but you're seeing a lot of sensory issues and a lot of hypersensitivity issues. And you're starting to see that, they're starting to have a lot of temperament issues and meltdowns and behavior issues and impulsivity issues, and they can't regulate themselves. And you're starting to see that there's a lot more meltdowns and tantrums happening, and they're starting to get worse, maybe some aggression. By the time they're a teenager, their nervous systems are exhausted, they're angry, anxious, depressed, but then we become adults. And by the time that we're adults, we're burnt out, stressed out, anxious, maybe angry still, adults who we've been dealing with this storm our whole lives. And we see this happen time and time and time and time and time again. And the common thread in all of this, guys, is the fact that the nervous system of a baby, when it's put into stress mode and we don't do something to change it, there are going to be consequences to this. Their nervous system is not built to be like this. Their nervous system is built to be calm and balanced. Because let me set the stage for you so you understand how the brain works, right? So the brain itself, for the brain above, talks to the body through what is called the autonomic nervous system and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has nerve roots that come out through the spine. And what they do is they have a communication system, kind of like a cell phone, where they're having conversations with every organ, gland, cell, and tissue in the body every moment of your life. And it is a conversation. It's what regulates beating of the heart, the digestion of our foods, controlling sensory input and output. It's a really important balance. And these two divisions here, right, the autonomic nervous system, composed of the parasympathetic, rest, digest, growth, development, healing, calming side of the nervous system, compared to the sympathetic, fight, flight, stress division of the nervous system. Those two systems are supposed to be on and working in harmony at all times, right? So going into stress mode when stress is necessary, but spending almost all the time calm and balanced and parasympathetic mode when you're a baby, because that's how a baby's nervous system is designed. You know, from the very beginning of life, they should be calm, sleeping tons, eating tons, happy, spending quality time, loving on mom and dad, chest to chest time, able to feed. But what we see constantly is babies that can't breastfeed, can't latch, can't suckle, are constipated, so are having tons of issues right from the very beginning. And these symptoms then begin to start to snowball into other things down the road. Because one of the biggest things you have to keep in mind is the nervous system has a rule. You can't be in growth and protection at the same time. That phrase is not mine. That was coined by Dr. Bruce Lipton, if you've ever heard his name before. He is the father of what is called epigenetics. It's one of the most important things you can understand is that the nervous system is changeable always in response to what's going on in the environment, whether it's chemical or physical or emotional stressors. The nervous system always changes. The genes always change in response to what we're exposed to. So another important term, the function of the nervous system is to perceive the environment and coordinate the behavior of all other cells. And I want you to understand this, because when you talk about this particular conversation, the nervous system requires perception. Because if we get proper perception from the environment, then we properly regulate every cell and gland and tissue in our body. If we don't have proper perception, then we can't properly regulate ourselves from inside out, from above down, inside out. Now, let's start about where all this starts, right? Because we talked a lot about the stress the birth process has, right? And now, when we talk about this, we have to understand that one of the biggest things that has changed at that moment when there are these birth traumas, early injuries, is perception. And so in chiropractic, we use this $2 word called subluxation. And I'm going to give you the kind of quick and dirty on what that means. So a subluxation in chiropractic literally means it is a vertebra or multiple vertebra that have misaligned, become fixated, aka they're not moving the way they're supposed to. We call it loss of kinetics, dyskinesia. When that happens, it changes the way the messages are coming into the brain. It alters the communication between the brain and the body from top down. Okay, because one of the things that our brain depends upon is normal motion of spinal vertebra. And parents will talk about how you can relate to this. When the spinal vertebra move the way they're supposed to, they produce a neurotransmitter called GABA. When they're producing this, our brain is calm, we have no issues, we don't feel pain. And that GABA keeps our nervous system, so we also are able to organize all the sensory input. If we have any area of the spine that stops moving, we start to produce a neurotransmitter called substance P. Now, substance P is a neurotransmitter that can turn into pain, but long before it turns into pain, substance P generates a response from the sympathetic nervous system. Now, if you have a child that's dealing with meltdowns, you have to understand this. Increasing levels of substance P create what's called a hypervigilant sympathetic nervous system, okay? And this is really important in this context, because the more substance P the brain is getting, the more active the fight or flight system becomes, the more likely a child is to go down the road of having high stress, high anxiety, quick temper, explosive temper, meltdowns, tantrums, things along that lines. So what it literally creates is a sensory processing issue, right? Altered perception. And altered perception ultimately is going to equal altered function. And this is a really big deal, because we know that the input from the brain helps with developing all systems, right? And we talk about kind of the way that the nervous system develops. It's built from bottom up, back, forward, and over time, and it's built in a very logical order. And so one of the most important things for the development, the healthy development of the brain, is the development of the motor system. Okay, so when we talk about the motion of the spine, When the spine moves the way that it should, all levels, the brain's getting a constant input of GABA through what's called proprioceptive input. Proprioception is our one sense that never shuts off. It is this sense that we depend upon incredibly high, because proprioception tells us where we are in space. Our brain uses it to send messages up to the spinal cord to plan our movements, to tell us where we are in relation to other objects, to tell us where we are from a balance, coordination. It also is required so that we can get motion up through the spine, up to the brain to calm us. And loss of motion results in sensory processing issues. It results in alterations in brain development and brain function. And the earlier that these subluxation patterns occur in a child, the more they are going to alter the developmental path of a child's brain and creating more and more big stress responses and potentially altering everything along the path. Because we see commonly effects in the gut, in the immune system, speech, social, emotional behavior, everything that you can possibly imagine on the developmental track. A subluxation that enters in the equation early can cause significant developmental issues. So this is a study called the Harvard Developing Child Study. And so I want to share this with you and a couple of other studies because, one of the big things that we have to really be aware of is that the way that our nervous system is exposed to things early in the environment will have long-term effects on the function of our nervous system, socially and emotionally throughout life. One of the big things they talked about in this study was the exposure to toxic stress weakens the architecture of the developing brain, which can lead to lifelong problems in learning, behavior, physical, and mental health. This is what we see. When a child is exposed to stress early, right? And if you're a parent that is dealing with meltdowns like we were, what you're seeing is the early exposure to stress, right? Now, toxic stress in this case, can be chemical or physical, can be emotional. We know that in most cases, there was that chemical emotional component, right, from early stress. There's oftentimes that high level of physical stress that's created by birth process. And if there's stress in the home environment, or we're eating, a lot of toxins in our diet or exposed to toxic chemicals, all of those things can create more toxic stress. And the bigger the stress is in the environment, the bigger the stress they're exposed to, the more that it's going to have an impact on cognitive, social, and emotional development. I hope this is making sense. If it is, do me a favor, drop a thumbs up. If you have questions about it, drop it in the comments. So one of the big things that I want you to understand about this is that, there is these critical developmental windows of the brain, right? So we talk a lot about the formative years. And so from birth until about 12, the brain is its most plastic and pliable. Neural connections are developing at a massive rate, building billions upon billions of connections and billions of neurons every year. And so the brain is going through this massive growth phase, but neuroplasticity becomes really important because the early exposure to stress can predispose and wire the brain to have this alteration in the developmental track, because areas that are really critical for executive function don't develop the way they're supposed to. So there's areas of the brain called the prefrontal cortex that really are essential for optimal development of how we do self-regulation, how we regulate our emotions, how we control our thoughts, how we control sensory input, how we plan our movements, how we pay attention, how we focus. And this is a really important concept because, moms and dads, if you have a child that is stuck in the perfect storm and the nervous system is on fight or flight and overdrive, you could be seeing effects in every single one of these areas of their quality of life. And one of the common questions we get from parents often is, when we talk about the perfect storm as an algorithm, right? Like, how do we know? Like, how do we know this is happening? Well, when we look at this, right, we as the doctors, we look at it and say, well, what are the stressors that a child was exposed to, and how long is the stress going on? It helps us as the doctors to be able to make decisions with our scans about what needs to be done to try and help to change the equation, calm the nervous system, get the nervous system back on track. And this is a really big piece. The nervous system is always changeable. Regardless of what your child has been through, it is always possible throughout their lifespan to change it. We've had kids, we have had little ones, infants, toddlers, where we've seen them be able to go and break the stress cycle. But we've had kids, well, technically not kids, adults that come in that have severe neurodevelopmental challenges like autism, severe issues with emotional regulation. We had one boy where he came in, he was 18 years old, and severe temper tantrums and outbursts, and a very aggressive autistic child. But after a few months of care, he was no longer having meltdowns and attacking his parents and his caregivers. So the brain's always changing. But one of the big things that we have to look at is we have to figure out how stressed out the nervous system is so we can start making the decision about what we can do to help. Now, when we look at the role of the neurospinal system, I want to talk to you about this because this is something when we think about the way that the brain and the body are connected to one another, it's really important that we understand this brain-body connection, because the spinal cord is always communicating with every organ, gland, and cell inside the body. It's not just a protective system of bones and a bunch of nerves. The spinal vertebrae, when they move, they have this really important role of calming the brain, giving us positional awareness, and organizing all sensory input. If we lack that in any way, shape, or form, there's disruption in organ and gland communication that can have ripple effects in every area of health. But there also becomes progressively larger input to the brain that arouses a fight or flight response. So the more areas of the spine that lose normal motion, that we lose proprioceptive input, that we lose the ability to get those signals back and forth, the greater the stress response that the brain is going to receive. One of the big things that you need to understand about this too is that the closer you get to the brainstem, the louder the loss of motion becomes. Think of it in decibels. If you go to the lower part of the screen where you see like the green areas where it's the lower back and the sacrum, that's the lowest decibel level, right? Even though when you hurt your back, it can hurt really bad, but the effect on the brain is not nearly as profound there. As you climb up and get closer and closer to the brainstem of the brain, so the nerves become more dense. And when you have a birth trauma to an area that's super dense in nerves and it's protecting the brainstem, which are the vital centers for maintaining life, if that area is subluxated, the noise that it creates to the brain is tremendous. And moms and dads, I want to give you context for this, because if you have a child that's having meltdowns, I want you to understand what it's like to develop with this. So for those of you that get headaches, okay, I want you to think about when you have a bad headache, okay? Let's take the pain and set that aside for a second. When you have a bad headache, number one, think about how stiff your neck is. Probably can't move it real well. Probably pretty uncomfortable if you're trying to turn your head. Probably not wanting to move it, trying to guard it. Secondly, have you ever noticed that when you have a bad headache, that oftentimes your senses seem like they're on overdrive? Lights seem really bright, sound seems super loud, sensations seem like they're on overdrive. And it's not uncommon that some people will get vertigo or dizziness when they get headaches. And a lot of people will get issues with nausea, or even some people will get issues with diarrhea. Now, let me ask you a simple question, right? When you have all of those symptoms, let's take, for example, if you're nauseous, is that a problem with the stomach, or is that a problem with the nerve to the stomach? If your answer is a problem with the nerve to the stomach, you're right, because it comes back to this alteration in input. When we have a subluxation, it creates a sensory processing problem. Altered input equals altered output. So if we have a subluxation on the neck that is causing us to get a headache, then the output is I'm going to have problems with regulating sensory input. I'm going to have head pain. I'm going to have heightened awareness to all my sensory input. And oh yeah, maybe my stomach's not going to feel awesome. Maybe I feel nauseous. Maybe I feel like I'm going to throw up. It's the alterations in the conversation from the neurospinal system that start to really drive the nervous system. So think of subluxation like this: stress stuck on. Now, there's this algorithm that I want to run you through. I'm going to do it pretty rapidly, right? So, but I want to give you context for this. So when you look at the first thing that we talked about, the loss of motion has a term, it's called dyskinesia. And dyskinesia is really the trigger point. This is what starts so many of the issues that we deal with these kids, because it's that loss of motion that starts in the earliest, most critical developmental phases. Now, I'm going to show you a video here in a second, because guys, this is so often the moonwalking bear. Okay, I'm going to show you this. If you have a squeamish stomach, I'm sorry, but it's important that you understand that this is what is happening every single day to our kids. This is a vacuum extractor that he's got on his baby. And look at the amount of force he's putting to pull that baby out.
Here's the girl. Here's the girl. Make it cute for the camera.
Now, that birth process right there, right? Cesarean section. This is later on in that video. This is the kind of traction they have to go and put on a baby's neck. So anywhere from 60 to 100 plus pounds on a brand new infant's neck. If you can look at this and say there's no injury, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, think about this. When you see this, you'd have to say that there's got to be some kind of an injury that can be sustained with this much traction when a baby's being pulled up by their head and neck alone, right? Shocking image, but I want you to understand this, because this is what we see time and time and time again, is these traumatic early childhood experiences, labor, delivery, high interventions. The bigger the intervention that we've seen, the bigger the problem that we see down the road. There is actually one study that I'll dig into it in a second that really dives into this. So I want to talk to you about cesarean rates. This study here only goes through 2012, but it's been a progressive increase in cesarean rates over the course of the last 40 plus years. It's been escalating more and more and more in use. And we know that the force that these cesarean sections produce is significant. There was one study that was done by a Dr. Sam Wang, who is a researcher out of Princeton, on a thing they call developmental diasthesis. So in layman's terms, what that means is it's disruption in sensory information coming into different areas of the brain. So developmental diasthesis says that an area that is critical for processing of all feedback from the spine called the cerebellum, they call it the little brain. When a cesarean section occurs, the injury to the spinal cord and the connection between the spinal cord and the cerebellum is so great that it can literally disrupt the developmental tract of the frontal lobe, because the sensory input from the spinal cord goes through the brainstem up to the cerebellum, up to the frontal lobe, and it's the path of all sensory input that drives the development of the higher centers of the brain that allow us to learn, to regulate our sensory input, to form speech, be social, emotional controlled, to learn how to plan, to focus, to pay attention, to be able to regulate our stress levels, all of those things. And one of the things that they found in the study, this is a really big thing that they noticed. They were talking about the development of autism because they realized that there is a significantly high rate of children in this study who had cesarean sections that were being diagnosed with autism. And one of the statements they said in this study is that cesarean section is so strongly correlated with the later onset of autism that the correlation is stronger than the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. Digest that statement for a minute, what that means. That birth process is so strongly connected to the later onset of autism, it's stronger than cigarette smoking and lung cancer. When I heard that statement for the first time, number one, it confirmed everything that we'd seen, because I cannot tell you of one child that I've ever taken care of that did not have a cesarean section. It's really rare that you don't see this with a lot of the kids that we take care of. Is it 100%? No, because there can be other traumas that can occur, but it's these table setter moments that trigger the nervous system to go into this significant state of fight or flight from birth injury. I want to show you another study here. This was done in an osteopathic hospital. And in the study done by these osteopaths, they found that 99 out of 100 infants had at least one pattern of what we would call subluxation. So in their terminology, it's a little bit different, but it's still the same thing. Loss of kinetics, loss of range of motion, that was found on physical exam in these babies. And so this is a big deal because even in their studies, they're seeing that this is part of the equation, that in nearly every child that's born, that there is subluxation patterns that are present. So this is a big deal because, when we look at this, right, we know that a subluxation in a child is a really big deal because it alters all of the input to a child's brain. And all of these studies here say the same thing. They're all showing these significant correlations between birth injury and the later onset of different types of neurodevelopmental challenges, changes in autonomic function, and so on and so forth. So if anybody wants to go and see these studies, I'd be more than happy to go and share these with you because these just go and add fuel to the fire of how significant a role birth process has in the later onset of neurodevelopmental challenges. So I want to set the stage for a term. So a term that is really important for us to understand is this term we call disafferentation. Input from all of the sensory system, all of the nerves that they're sending messages from the extremities, from the internal organs, all of that information is called afferent, means input to the brain. The output from the brain is called efferent. When there are subluxations present on the spine, this is called disafferentation, abnormal neurological sensory input. That is why at the core root of all of these issues is a problem with sensory processing that triggers a fight or flight response. And in kids who deal with meltdowns, what it does is that there is so much background noise that their nervous system hits this crescendo where we see temper tantrums and meltdowns because the fight or flight response is so big because the information coming in is so wrong. So I want to show you a short video here that talks about sensory processing. Hopefully this will give you a little more insight.
Some kids are really bouncy and can't sit still. Some kids aren't very coordinated. Some see food as a pile of toxic goo that hurts their mouth and jangles their taste buds. School might be a mysterious place where things don't make much sense. If this sounds like you may have sensory processing disorder, and we're going to explain it here. Your body has 7 senses: vision in your eyes, hearing in your ears, touch in your skin, taste in your mouth, and smell in your nose. And you have 2 movement senses, your muscles and your sense of balance. In sensory processing disorder, these senses don't communicate right with your brain. Think of the nerves connecting your brain and senses as a set of roads. Those roads should be smooth superhighways so that the senses and brain can communicate fast. If you have sensory processing disorder, then some of your roads are bumpy and rough.
I want to stop right there because if you look at exactly what that says, this right here is exactly what we were just talking about. Is all that information is coming in, it's disafferentation coming right through the brainstem, and the information's coming in and it's altered. And it alters everything from a developmental standpoint for that child's brain until something is done to change the way the sensory input is coming into their brain. Because at the root of it is we have improper proprioceptive input. It's the perception of movement. And I have to tell you, this is a big piece. If you have a child that's ever been in occupational therapy, what do? They do proprioceptive exercises to try to stimulate and calm the brain, but also to drive the brain to get the frontal lobe back into developmental mode. Because proprioceptive input is just the most important of all nutrients for the brain. And the place that it is most densely coming from is from the spine, and most specifically the upper neck. And let me give you just some important details on this, because if you look at the spinal column as a whole, right? So if you go from the base of the spine up to C3, which is the 3rd vertebra. So you've got the base of the skull, C1, C2, C3. Okay. If you go C4 down to the base of the spine, that's 70% of the proprioceptors in the spine. 30% are located between C3, C2, C1 and the base of the skull. So I want you to fathom that. Anytime that the brain and the body puts a density of nerves, it's because they're more important than the other places. And these areas here in the upper neck are far more important because they protect the most critical centers for life. The brainstem is where the centers that regulate our breathing, where we regulate our autonomics, where all the information is coming in and crossing over to different parts of the brain for sorting and processing. Every vital structure lives in the brainstem, and sorts the information to go on up into the higher structures of the brain. So if we lose it in those areas, the consequences are pretty significant. So the counterpart to proprioception is a thing called nociception. And so think of it as noxious stimuli. Okay, anytime that we lose motion, nociception comes in and it creates a harmful stimuli to the nervous system. And what happens is that loss then creates an opening. The loss of proprioceptive input creates an opening for nociceptive input, substance P, to reach the brain and turn on the fight or flight system, creating background noise. Think of it kind of like listening to Metallica, right? If you are listening to Metallica, what is your emotional state like? Are you on fight or flight mode? Are you stressed? Maybe feel a little angry, maybe feel a little bit aggressive. This is what a child's getting in the background of their brain at all times if they have subluxations in critical areas, especially as you get closer and closer to the fight or flight nerves and the brainstem. So when we talk about the way that the brain works, one of the biggest things you have to understand is that areas of the brain are going to be directly affected. So one of the areas that we see that is most affected by this is an area of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is known as the stress and anxiety center. So the amygdala has the job of trying to protect us. So when we go through life and we perceive things, right, the amygdala tells us dangerous, not dangerous. Do I need to be on guard, not on guard? It's a very primitive part of the brain, because what it does is it's kind of like the caveman down by the watering hole, and a saber-toothed lion, a saber-toothed tiger jumps out to catch caveman. So caveman has one of two responses. He's either going to fight or flee, or technically he thought he could freeze, but if he's freezing, he's done. So at that moment, his amygdala says, oh, you are a saber-toothed tiger, you're dangerous. I need to turn on the fight or flight system immediately. And the brain sends neurological impulses throughout the entire body to rapidly turn on the fight or flight response so that he can either fight the saber-toothed tiger or run like heck. And so when he goes into this mode, the fight or flight system kicks on and it shuts off the parasympathetics entirely. And what ends up happening is that you start seeing other things happen, right? So the brain is shunting energy into the muscles, into the heart, into the lungs. It's going into non-critical, or going into all critical systems and taking it away from all non-critical systems. That's why you see so many kids when they get stressed out, right? They lose focus, they lose attention, they lose the ability to regulate their emotions because their nervous system is becoming wired into this rapid state of fight or flight because their amygdala is on overdrive. They call it hypervigilance. And so the more hypervigilant the amygdala is, then the more profound the stress response is going to be when a child gets even mildly stressed. And then you see these meltdowns and temper tantrums because the nervous system has no room to handle stress because it's on overdrive and the amygdala is overactive. And we see it in other areas too. You know, one of the common things that happens is that when the nervous system is stressed out, is you see that there is a very big effect on things like memory, both short-term and long-term. We lose things like spatial memory, situational awareness, so many different things. The hippocampus is our memory processing center. So we need this area to be functioning well for school, but for life. And one of the things that we know is that stress dramatically affects the hippocampus. It'll affect our ability to process short-term and long-term memories. That's oftentimes where you see that when a child has a temper tantrum or a meltdown, they may not even remember what they do because the brain's fight or flight response is so strong, it blocks the formation of memory. And if you have a child that doesn't remember what they do when they have a meltdown, this is exactly why. They call it a limbic break is the term. There's also other areas that are really critical to development that shut off when we're in major league stress mode. And there's an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is incredibly important because it's what regulates all of the higher functions of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is where we develop focused attention. It's where we develop speech. It's where we develop proprioceptive awareness, where we do gross and fine motor control. It regulates so many functions of the things that we need to be a high functioning human. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that one of the things that the prefrontal cortex does is it also dampens down stress. If we have a high functioning prefrontal cortex, it shuts the amygdala down when it should be on. It tells things, it gives proper emotional context, so the prefrontal cortex is able to keep the amygdala calm. If we get a big switch in the nervous system and the nervous system gets stuck in fight or flight, this persistent activation of the fight or flight system triggers a switch called a dysautonomia, where the brain is stuck in fight or flight mode and cannot shut it off. And it alters the ability of the prefrontal cortex to develop like it's supposed to. That's why so many kids that we see that have temperament issues and emotional regulation issues and meltdowns and tantrums also are dealing with executive function issues. Because now you may have a hypervigilant amygdala, but you also have an underperforming prefrontal cortex that isn't doing its job to recognize social situations or to ability to rotate objects in space or to pay attention and focus or to regulate sensory input. So now you've got sensory processing layered with attention issues, layered with emotional issues, layered with anxiety, and all of those things are a perfect storm that are building and brewing over time. That's why we talk about this term as being so important, because this stress in the nervous system, when it's on perpetually and we don't shut it off, then it's going to have this cascade of effects that can happen throughout their entire life. Because dysautonomia is when we've gotten to a point where the nervous system is so wired into this state that the regular nervous system doesn't even know how to regulate the balance anymore between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, how do we change it? One big hack, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the parasympathetic nervous system. The vagus nerve is what regulates all growth, development, and healing. It is what turns on the prefrontal cortex. It is what calms the amygdala. It is what calms our brain, our body. When we get the vagus nerve turned on, the entire body calms down. Pretty profound statement. If you have a child that is dealing with temper tantrums and meltdowns and any of the other symptoms that we talked about, they have an underperforming vagus nerve. And I want you to understand this, because if you've done any research on how to help your child, you're probably seeing lots of things that say vagus. The one thing I can tell you is that very few people have a way to really turn the vagus nerve on. You probably hear lots of hacks, right? Do deep breathing, do yoga, do these movements, and they're all good. But the problem is if the child's brain is getting background stress at all times, it's temporary at best because you're not getting to the cause. So when we look at the vagus, we have this really powerful thing called an adjustment that has the ability to alter that. So let me show you this quick study. So one of the things that they showed in this study here that was done in the Journal of Integrated Neuroscience is that parasympathetic function in children with sensory processing disorder is way low. It shows a very underperforming vagus nerve, aka a very active sympathetic nervous system and high levels of nociceptive input that are disrupting the function of the vagus. This is a really, really important thing for you to keep in mind. So another study here on the vagus nerve and control of the intestines. So one of the things that we know about the gut immune axis is that the vagus is what regulates all of those things. So if we have a sympathetic dominant nervous system, and maybe some of you adults can relate to this. You know, if you have a lot of stress and you have irritable bowel syndrome or you have other issues with your GI, right, you probably have an underperforming vagus. If you have a child that has a nervous tummy, right, they complain of stomach aches all the time, or they have bowel issues, or they can't they have diarrhea, or they can't regulate their bowel movements the way they're supposed to, and they're constipated. Underperforming vagus. Too little vagus equals lots of issues with the GI, what they call the gut immune axis. That's why so many kids that have an underperforming vagus are sick a lot, because the vagus nerve is what our body uses to regulate our immune function, to regulate our GI. It is the most important nerve in the entire body by a lot. Now, one of the things that we as chiropractors do is we have to be able to look at all of these things and see what's coming out. One of the terms that we use a lot is a term called dysbinesis. Dysbinesis is a reversible pathophysiological state. So we use the term, it's errors in energy output and expenditure. So if you have a child that has temper tantrums and meltdowns, I think you could probably say there's some errors in energy output and expenditure, because oftentimes you see rapid increase in energy, hyperactivity. You tend to see oftentimes that they can go from 0 to 100 because they can't regulate their energy and their emotions. So dysbinesis is something that we can measure. And this is where we start to really be able to help out, because when you look at all the signs and the symptoms, right, we have to have some windows in. And so when we look at dysbinesis, this is what dysbinesis looks like to us. So when we do a test called a surface EMG, okay, what a surface EMG allows us to do is to be able to measure the output from the proprioceptors. And this is really important because if you look here at this scan, okay, so what they're doing is this is an initial scan on a patient, and all of these areas of white are normal. But when you see these areas of green, green's 1 standard deviation above normal, blue is 2, and red is 3. So anytime you see these areas where you've got high levels of reds, greens, and blues, you've got way too much proprioceptive or nociceptive input coming into the brain, because the proprioceptor is not firing correctly. So what you see is these patterns of a really big imbalances in energy output and expenditure. And so if this is what's coming into your child's brain, what do you expect to come out of your child's brain? Now, what you look at here is you look at course of care, right? So this little dude here, about a month into care, we'd already broken through on the energy, and you'd seen the energy levels start to drop down, right? So when you get another month in, you see that the energy levels are much, much lower, the patterns are much more organized. And so what's happening is the nervous system is getting calmed input, because every time that you adjust the spine, you alter kinetics, you alter afferentation, and you change dysbinesis. You start to change energy output from that child, because you change proprioception, you get rid of nociception, you start getting proper sensory input to the brain, and you activate the vagus nerve. And this is really where the magic in all this is, because if you can change that, you can change the way the brain is working. And this is such a big piece of the equation. I want to show you a couple of quick examples here of what it looks like when a child is showing these signs of dysbinesis and disconnection in the nervous system. So this is our little buddy Evan. So I want you just to look at him and see where he is in this video versus the next video.
Bye, Aunt Kristen. See you later.
Does he look very engaged or connected?
Oh, no? Did you have fun? Did you have fun?
Is he engaged with his mom?
Yes? Yes? Do you love Aunt Kristen? Say yes. Yeah.
So this little guy was on the road to getting a diagnosis of autism. When we first met him, this is what his scans look like up top. So this is dysautonomia. This is imbalanced output from the brain to the spinal cord. This is dysautonomia. This is what this looks like. This is a nervous system that is not connected. This is a nervous system that is on overdrive. This is a nervous system that's not getting the proper proprioceptive input to calm the brain. So let's take a look at this next one. And I think this is pretty cool because, you know, after a few months in care, So everything had changed. So Mama wrote this really awesome testimonial saying that he was more balanced and he was walking. He was talking like crazy 24/7, following directions. And they had seen massive changes. Like, and let me show you the difference here in him from the little boy that you saw in the video before. Look at how much more connected and engaged he is with his dad.
There's a bird. What's that one? Goody. What is it? Goody. A dog? Yes, I am. Yep. I do truck. What's that? A truck. A truck? A fast truck. Fast truck. A fast.
Besides the fact being one of the cutest kids that God has ever created, can you tell the difference in that little boy from this little boy? Far happier, far more connected, far more engaged, making eye contact. That's a calm nervous system. That is a nervous system that's disconnected because there's nothing but background noise coming in. So I want to share with you a couple of stories here that are more recent. So this is our little buddy, Anthony. This little dude has absolutely crushed every goal that we set for him. When he started in care, his big thing that mom and dad were struggling with was his meltdowns. He was having them a lot. And it was really, really life-altering. He was having them 7 days a week. It was becoming a huge issue, and it was interfering with quality of life in a big way. In just 2 months, he went to having near zero meltdowns. If you look at the testimony here, it says, with just 2 months in care, he went from multiple daily meltdowns to none for weeks at a time. The best part is Anthony is still early in his care plan and has already had massive improvements. So guys, this is pretty cool because, I mean, if you look at this, right, I mean, he's got better emotional regulation, fewer meltdowns, calmer brain and body, and a more balanced nervous system in a matter of just 2 months. So I want to show you a couple of other quick stories here. So this is our buddy Tyler's mom. Now, Tyler's biggest issue is more of like an ADHD focus and attention issue, but listen to what she has to say.
All right, so I have all three of my kids going to chiropractic care. So we started seeing Dr. Scott when my youngest, he's now in 7th, so he was in 4th, and he was just really withdrawn. We knew he had a diagnosis of ADHD. We've tried medicine, all sorts of medicine. And he was just, as a result, I think, becoming very, very withdrawn. And not wanting to make friends, not talking in class, and just not himself at all. So we started chiropractic care with him initially, and I didn't tell any of his teachers we were doing it. Within 3 weeks, I swear, within 3 weeks, his teachers were emailing me, oh my gosh, Tyler's smiling, he's raising his hand all the time, like, what is going on? This is amazing. And then at that point I had said, like, we had started chiropractic care. So absolutely huge, like, life-changing results for him. Just getting, I mean, his grades were great, but just in terms of socialization, participation, interaction with others, like an amazing, amazing, amazing changes for him.
So this is our little buddy Lincoln's mom, and she also has a really cool story about some of the changes he made. This is a real short video as well, but I wanted to share you this because I know that if you've been searching for answers to help your child, I know oftentimes it feels hopeless, right? And so it's these stories of parents who've been on this road before you that I hope is helpful for you to know what's possible, because every time that we talk to a parent, right, you guys are coming in and you're looking for hope. Right? You're looking for help. You're looking for someone who's able to go and offer a change to the quality of life that your child's dealing with right now. And these are stories of hope that I hope give you some inspiration.
Hi, my name is Carla Rufus, and we started coming to Elite Chiropractic after my husband came for a back injury. Afterwards, we brought our son Lincoln. He is autistic and has ADHD to help with his sensory needs and meltdowns. The clinic has been just completely amazing. Lincoln has been, he has changed. He's gone from just melting down at the drop of a hat to being able to express his emotions and feelings by coming weekly. And he is able to maintain conversations with us and be able to do other things instead of his just preferred activities. We're so grateful for Dr. Scott, Dr. Brandon, and Dr. Lena because they've completely changed our better.
So I hope that these stories give you some help and some inspiration, because one of the big things that I would encourage all of you to do is if you have a child that is struggling with these, keep asking questions and finding answers. And then the other thing is that start looking at removing the 3 T's, right? The thoughts, the traumas, the toxins, the chemical, the physical, and the emotional stresses. And I know that many of you may be having some questions about, what is this something that may help my child? There's only one way to know is to get them scanned. If you're interested in learning more about this, I think probably the best way for us to be able to connect and find out, what is going on is to be able to answer questions for you. Because, in our office, one of the things that we do is we go through and we do neuroscans and we do histories and consults to find out what the big stressors are and what is going on inside of life, what the history is like for a child, so that we can answer questions. And so that would be obviously one of the big things that we want to do to help you. And listen, if you're not in our geographical area and you're seeing this, I am happy to connect you with doctors that are in your geographical area, because we have a network of many hundreds of doctors who do just like we do. So if you are interested in learning more, let me know and I will get you connected to doctors in your geographical area, because the goal here is to help every single parent who's in need of these resources to connect you. I want to share with you just a couple of quick things here, because one of the big things that we have is we have this really critical window, right? The nervous system is super changeable. The brain is always changeable throughout the lifespan, but one of the biggest things is that we really want to try and get in as early as we can, because the changeability window is the biggest. So I would encourage you, to think about getting your child scanned as soon as possible, because the earlier that you intervene, the bigger and more profound the changes can make, and the more that you can alter the course of their quality of life. I did have one thing I wanted to add in is one of the things that we get frequently asked is about what do the scans measure. So the scans that I showed you above it's a 3-scan set. And we were able to go and measure the balance between the fight or flight and the rest and digest nervous systems, the autonomic nervous system through what's called a heart rate variability. Probably my favorite of all tests, because it really does give us some amazing insight into how well a child's nervous system is adapting or is not adapting to the stress of life. The other side is we're able to go and use a technology called a surface EMG to be able to measure the input to a child's brain. And this measurement is a really powerful tool, because it allows us to go and see what the proprioceptors are doing, see what the patterns look like. So it helps us to go and measure what needs to be done to be able to go and change the input to calm the nervous system down. And there's a third test called a thermal scan. And the thermal scan allows us to see what's coming out from the brain into the spinal cord. This is a really big deal, because when the nervous system is on overdrive and the spinal cord is not getting the messages back and forth, we're going to see very clear patterns on the spinal cord of areas of imbalance, areas of issues with communication. And we watch all 3 of those scans together to check changes in the nervous system of a child, but also to get a baseline. And we use those as we progress through a course of a care plan to track change in the nervous system until we get to a place where the nervous system is calm at the end of the care plan. So moms and dads, I thank you so much for taking the time tonight. One of the things I do want to share with you is if you have any questions, I will drop a link into the Facebook group. So if you want to talk with me about questions or concerns that you have, I will drop the link for a free 15-minute consult for anybody who is interested, so that you can ask questions. We can try and find ways to help your child, connect you with other doctors if necessary. Or if you are in our local market here, we would also be happy to talk with you about your child and do anything we can to help you and your family. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I hope this was helpful, that you took some good information from this. Hopefully it gave you some resources that can empower you to know that there is so much more that can be done to help your child to live a better quality of life. I thank you so much for being here. And again, we will be having another webinar next month. And we will be talking about sensory processing disorder. So don't hesitate to jump in. I would love to see anybody back on there again, so we can help to reach as many families as we possibly can. All right. This is Dr. Scott. God bless you guys. Have a great evening.